Hey, George Johnson.
John, hi. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm on my summer vacation.
Oh, already?
Yeah.
Wow.
Academia is awesome.
Oh, yeah. I thought that came after Memorial Day.
I actually had my last class on, I think it was like May 4th, and
Hmm.
I had my last exam. Uh, when was it? Sometime last week. I graded them the
Oh,
same day because I hate to
wow.
have that hanging over me. And
Yeah,
so I am on my summer break until the end of August.
that's great. Nice work, if you can get it.
Yeah. Eh,
There's a David Lodge, one of his novels about academia called that.
George?
Yeah.
Oh, called nice work if you can get it. Right. Okay, sorry. I thought I was already having a glitch with the new Blogging Heads
Oh,
system.
right. Yeah.
Right.
I'm on the old system, so
Hey,
I don't yet know what that's like.
I should mention for Blogging Heads groupies, or maybe I should say Bob Wright groupies, that I actually saw Bob Wright, the founder and overseer of the Blogging Heads industry.
Hmm.
Um, Last Sunday, he was speaking at a Unitarian church in Morristown, New Jersey, about all the stuff that Bob talks about, the
Yeah,
meaning of life
yeah.
and everything. And
Oh,
and they asked me to be a respondent
oh, cool.
in this place. So
Mhm.
yeah, so it was fun, shooting the shit in front of all these people, just as we have done on Blogging Heads before,
Ah,
and as I
it's like,
do every summer out on the beach in
right.
Nantucket when I see Bob.
Logging Heads comes to the beach,
Yeah,
and Logging Heads comes to the Unitarian Church in Morristown, New Jersey.
I I think Bob and his wife Lisa, who's an old friend of mine, I think they hang out at a Unitarian church, and the Unitarians I met were were wonderful, gentle people. I think the Unitarians are. It's about as attenuated you can be and still call yourself a Christian or
Yeah, I
religious.
think so. And I don't know the history of how it became that way because Unitarianism used to be this very strict fire and brimstone kind of fundamentalism.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, like I mean, it was, contrasting with Trinitarianism and then Unitarianism, like in Boston, the Boston Unitarian religious establishment. I think that was, there was the famous minister whose name I'm forgetting, but it's interesting. So there must be some really interesting history there that explains how it evolved or devolved depending on one's point of view.
Yeah, it's got a lot of attractive features. I think in general they do not believe. You can believe that Jesus was a supernatural figure who performed miracles and rose from the dead and all that. But
Mm,
the folks I talked to said that that is actually unusual among Unitarians. Most of them see Jesus as just this very wise,
metaphor.
inspirational um, figure, and they believe in tolerance of all other faiths. There are lots of paths to the mountaintop, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
well, that's all good.
yeah, yeah, it's all
I
yeah.
remember when I was, still probably elementary school or early junior high, and it must have been my father decided we should go to a Unitarian church
Hmm.
because we had been, very sporadically going to a Methodist church, and I think he was starting not to like that, and I don't know about my mom, but so he brought us to this Unitarian church, and the main thing I remember was, and this is a, a very old memory, so take it with, some doubt, but instead of a sermon, we had a lecture on the dangers of nuclear power from a University of New Mexico physics professor named Charles Hyder, who
Aha.
was very, very. He later he was a huge man. He probably weighed 300 pounds, and he later went on this long, months-long fast as he sat on a bench outside of the White House, and he wasn't going to start eating again until they banned nuclear weapons or something.
And did he last a really long time?
He did last a long time, and he didn't let himself die. It was kind of like when Dick Gregory, started fasting until the Vietnam War was over, and at some point he declared it was over.
Declared victory.
Not to say he didn't go through a sacrifice, but yeah. So I remember that, and then I'm sure I have this memory of standing up and opening some sort of version of a hymnal and singing a hymn, thanking God for making us skeptical.
Wait a minute, was this your hymn, or was everybody else singing also?
No, everyone in the Unitarian Church. I mean, could that possibly be true, or did my memory manufacture that?
That sounds that would mesh with what I gleaned from these people. That doubt is an important part of their worldview, or kind of humility. Also,
thank you, God, for letting us, for not requiring us to believe in you.
Yeah, and I think there is a tradition of having. Anybody who wants to can get up and talk, and they have lots of guest speakers. So Bob had actually given a sermon earlier in the day. I met him not in a church, but in some kind of secular venue. But earlier that morning, he had been in a Unitarian church giving a little a sermon of some kind. And
really, Bob was giving a sermon. That's great.
Yeah. Well, come on, Bob has always given a sermon in one way or another.
Yeah. But they actually, this was officially called that.
Right.
So, yeah.
So he's come out as a preacher. And they also have a tradition of social activism, which is very, very appealing to me.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, sort of like Quakers. Anyway, I guess if I was going to be religious, I'd certainly take a look at the Unitarians. I remember John Wheeler, the great physicist. I think he was a Unitarian. Anyway, he quoted this line when I interviewed him more than 20 years ago, and said that Unitarianism is a feather bed to catch falling Christians. And I quoted that to a couple of these Unitarians on Sunday, and they liked that. They thought that was quite appropriate, actually.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. So anyway, all right. So I thought we could talk about cancer again today, because you've got a really, I thought, upbeat, fascinating piece of reporting in your most recent column for the New York Times. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if, just...
my columns on cancer usually aren't that upbeat, I guess. At least I've been told that.
Yeah.
But just because I, have this general pessimism that when you're dealing with something that's so completely different from really any other ailment or whatever you want to call it than cancer, something that's actually, evolving in your body and becoming fitter and fitter as it finds ways to, defeat everything thrown against it, whether it's the body's immune system or chemotherapy later on, evolving little workarounds that, and that's happened with, every treatment we try. And now the big excitement is with cancer immune therapy, where you actually, usually the way they describe it is unleash the immune system to go after the cancer, which leads to, it brings up all kinds of interesting questions, like why cancer doesn't attack the immune system in the first place, and how does the, given that, how can we make it do so?
Yeah, I assume that you were aware of this research before you went to this meeting.
Yeah, I'd been following it. Well, yeah, all while I was writing my book, toward the end of while I was when I was finishing the manuscript for the Cancer Chronicles, this was starting to make a resurgence. I mean, the immune therapy of cancer is something that's, the excitement has waxed and waned for more than a century, going back to the late 1900s, when a physician named William Coley, I think his name was, he noticed that some of his patients, his cancer patients, who had coincidentally acquired some really bad bacterial or viral infection, they seemed to do better, and at least for a while were able to resist the development of cancer. And I don't know how long that lasted, but it was kind of the first inkling that the fact that the immune system could possibly still be used to attack this internal invader.
And the concept of vaccines for cancer, that goes way back too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and that's all part of it. And some people define immune therapy to include these monoclonal antibodies, where you have drugs like Herceptin for certain kinds of breast cancer, where you use a monoclonal antibody that that latches onto a certain receptor on a cell. In this case, it's called the HER2 receptor, HER, and this is something that appears in great overabundance in cancer cells of a certain type of breast cancer. So the idea is if you can hone in on those, you can focus your attack on the cancer cells themselves and less so on the surrounding healthy tissue. Although the fact is that healthy tissue has these same receptors, just fewer of them. So,
well, I was going to ask you about monoclonal antibodies because when I was in journalism school in let's see, it was 82 and 83, so more than 30 years ago, we, as I recall, went to a pharmaceutical company research lab somewhere in northern New Jersey, and were told about this new therapy, monoclonal antibodies, that was getting people really excited, and some people were saying might be a cure for cancer.
Yeah, and it's they've had some great effects with them. Again, like with HER2 breast cancer and with melanoma. Again, a certain type of melanoma with a certain type of mutation on the BRAF gene or the BRAF gene, and but like with all of these things, they get very good results, and then maybe extend patients' lives months and maybe years. And we're talking usually about stage 4 metastatic cancer, and in cancers where that's almost always a death sentence and a very, very quick death, and extending these by months and sometimes years. Mm-hmm. But the same sad story keeps happening. There's exceptions, as there is with everything, but the general thing is the cancer will, the tumor will continue. The tumor cells will continue dividing and randomly mutating, and at some point, one of these mutations will allow it to resist the monoclonal antibody therapy. So then they end up combining it with the second monoclonal antibody therapy, and then that works wonders for a while. But it's just kind of a constant catch-up game with the evolving immune system. And the thing that's exciting about the catch-up game with the evolving tumor, and what's exciting about the immune system, though, is it also is capable of evolving.
Yeah.
Because, it's not just capable of, that's how it works. So, the clonal selection theory of immunity is really the dominant idea of how the immune system generates all of these immune cells against a certain invader.
Can you just briefly remind the viewer? I hate to put the heavy lifting on you.
It's a very weird idea. Well, not so weird when you think about it. But okay, so I don't know what count you could come up with, but all of the many, many thousands or millions of possible invaders or outside in the world that might get under your skin or into your bloodstream, and you need to react to them. And then, going even beyond every possible logical combination of molecules that could give you, a different different, invading, bacteria or virus, and it, with a certain like molecular signature on its surface, so kind of its face. So, there's a potentially, essentially for all purposes, infinite number of combinations of molecules that your immune system might be faced with when it's examining the face of an invader to decide if it's enemy or friend.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the immune system do this, rather effectively? And one way would be that, when you're born or as you develop in the fetus and maybe early in life, that you slowly just generate an antibody for, every possible invader. And, that seemed a little far-fetched. And then, or another possibility is when one of your immune cells happens to spot one of these invaders, then it sends the instructions back to central control, and they say, here's the information, and here's the kind of antibodies we need to develop to latch on to the invader and kill it.
Mm-hmm.
But the insight that that this theory drew on was the Darwinian connection, the power of Darwin in figuring out how you can generate, a random number of potentially infinite types, and then use the power of selection to choose one. I'm not explaining this very well.
No, it's coming back to me. I think I remember that.
It's in my. I have a couple of paragraphs in my article that I really struggled over. But yeah, so basically, essentially, in the same way, this is the best way to explain it, I think. In the same way that, you say, how is it that the ecosystem of the world, that every conceivable niche is occupied by a different form of life?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how did God do that? And if you don't believe in God, or at least a designer, creator type God, then you believe in Darwin's explanation, which is that, basically life generates this huge assortment, randomly generates this huge assortment of possible creatures, and the ones that can find a niche and hang in there are going to survive, and then they're going to compete against ones that don't quite fit the niche as well. And in that way, they will become honed, ever more finely to their niche.
Right.
And of course, there's all sorts of complications. And this is really the modern interpretation of Darwin, the so-called neo-Darwinian synthesis. But so if that happens with, the organisms of the earth, why can't it happen with the immune system, where it just generates a whole diversity of different species, you could call them, of immune cells? And then when one of them happens just randomly to bump into one of these invaders, that triggers that particular immune cell to start dividing like crazy and making clones of itself.
Right.
So you get this army, this what they call a clone in biology of identical immune cells.
Mm-hmm.
And that leaves out all kinds of steps and B cells, T cells, antibodies, histocompatibility, complex molecules, dendritic cells. But what I was trying to do in my column was to explain all that with the metaphor I just used, but just in a few paragraphs, and not get bogged down on all the terminology that you fall into with explaining immunology.
Well, yeah, but I love the framework. I loved how you put it within the framework of natural selection and evolution, and so forth. To me, that really helped to make it clear. But what's the novelty? What are the researchers trying to do to exploit this natural mechanism?
Yeah. So basically, what we have here is you can think of it as Darwin versus Darwin. Mm-hmm. Cancer is so powerful because it draws on random variation and natural selection, so that the tumor becomes continually fitter inside your body. Mm-hmm. In my book, I compare it to a quasi-creature, that's becoming, ever fitter at the expense of the host in the ecosystem of your body. Mm-hmm. So in the immune system, obviously, we're pretty sure it's obvious, but it's generally agreed that works on the same principle of Darwinian random selection, random variation and selection. So why can't the immune system keep up with the cancer cell? And one answer is that the cancer cell early on is going to, one of its random mutations may be an ability to evolve a chemical that essentially sends, back away signals to the immune system. Stay out of here. No, it's okay. Nothing to see here.
Right.
Move on. And another answer is that cancer is not something that's coming from outside your body and then developing in it, but it's actually your own cells that are mutating. And a lot of mutations, don't produce, a new envelope, a new phenotype for the cell that's recognizable as enemy.
Right.
So the new drugs, the idea is that we know, and then the third aspect is your body has all these natural mechanisms to keep the immune system, from eating yourself.
Right.
So it's constantly, and to keep it from going overboard. So like if you get an infection, you want the immune system to fight it, to identify the invader by its molecular signatures, antigen, and then you want it to create an army to attack that invader, but then you want the immune system to ramp down and stop so you don't have like chronic inflammation.
Right.
And to do that, they have certain things they've come to call immune system checkpoints. And these are things that turn the immune system back down naturally after it's been activated. But cancer cells, the ones, they can evolve the ability to do the same thing by enacting these immune checkpoints and turning off the system, or they might not even have to do it themselves. It might just be the checkpoints, inside the body, the natural ones. They're saying, oh, well, yeah, there's this cancer here, and maybe they start a little minor inflammation, and then it gets turned off because, it doesn't seem like it's any big deal. So these new drugs kind of go in and they take the brakes off the immune system. They block the immune checkpoints. So that unleashes the immune system to go after the tumor. Now, there's all kinds of obvious problems with that.
Because then you have to worry about over-aggressive immune responses that might harm the body in other ways.
Exactly. And so it's a trade-off. But they're finding that with, first, you're talking about stage 4 metastatic cancers that are almost always deadly, like melanoma. And in these cases, almost any trade-off is worthwhile. But even better than that, they're finding that with different anti-inflammatory drugs, that they can control the immune system, just enough to keep you from having like a huge autoimmune reaction, while at the same time going after the cancer cells. So it's very tricky, but it's been remarkably successful on certain cancers. And when I was at the meeting in Philadelphia that I mentioned in my column, there was one scientist, James Allison, who was describing a metastatic melanoma patient he had who's now past her 10th year in what appears to be complete remission. They actually see these tumors shrink. And the big questions are, is that, she's just at the edge of the bell curve, and, most patients haven't been receiving the therapy nearly that long. So is this going to keep going? And does it quash the tumor enough that it's not going to evolve a workaround? And if it does, is there a way to, make a workaround around the workaround? And it's all very much up in the air, but there's this huge amount of optimism like I haven't seen in the few years that I've been covering this.
Yeah, so I mean, are we talking about individual cases or a handful of cases? I mean, at what point can people start getting really excited? I mean, there's no commercial product close to being available yet.
Well, there actually is. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They. But I mean, they're used. The pharmaceutical companies are already marketing some of these under brand names, and. But basically, it's two different kinds of immune checkpoint inhibitors, and now they're using those in combination in some cases, which raises the risks, but makes it more effective. But again, these things are considered still so experimental and risky that they're only used on patients where other kinds of treatment have not worked, and only under only with certain cancers where they seem to be especially effective. And one of these is melanoma.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the questions. I came to the meeting, I kept reading this, and I said, why melanoma? Why is this particularly vulnerable to this new therapy? And it turns out that the dominant theory is that it's because melanoma has an unusual number of mutations compared to a lot of other cancers, and it just gives the immune system, once it's unleashed, more targets to go after.
Huh.
And another explanation is with certain other cancers, like they've had some good results with kidney cancer,
Mm-hmm.
metastatic kidney cancer. And in this case, there's an entirely different explanation that involves epigenetics that I didn't get into, and then certain leukemias, and one general thing they're starting to think may be true, including with melanoma, is that if there's already a weak smoldering immune reaction in place that's making a feeble attempt to go after the tumor, and it's already kind of started, but it's just very cool embers that you can unleash that and it will heat up and go after the tumor. So it's
Wow.
much is up in the air, but it's a lot further along than I think many people had expected a few years ago.
Do you have? I mean, is there any way to calculate costs at this point?
Oh yeah, it's typically $10,000 a month. So we're back to
Right.
back to that story. And the one thing that struck me is, like with the monoclonal antibodies, the story was using these singly, and they seem to be working amazingly, and it's this wonderful new thing. And then before the tumors evolved a workaround, and now they're coming up with something, something else to try. And
Right.
and and they're doing combinations of monoclonal antibodies. Well, now at this meeting, some of the big news was they found that a combination of two different checkpoint inhibitors would work where single ones weren't that effective. And the one of these is called ipilimumab,
Mm-hmm.
and I forget the name of the other one, but yeah, if somebody's curious. I don't really bother to learn the commercial names of these things, but if somebody looks up the American Association of Cancer Research meeting for this year in Philadelphia, you can see there was an announcement of two of these brand name immune checkpoint inhibitors, and a trial in which their combination was particularly effective. And this was big news among the business press that covers the pharmaceutical industry. But yeah, $10,000 a month. So
Yeah.
Again, it's our screwed up medical system as far as costs.
Well, yeah. I wanted to get to costs in a little bit. I wanted to ask you first about there was a piece in Scientific American that caught my eye recently, and it's about genetic testing for diagnosis of cancer and guidance of treatments, and that's gotten a lot of attention recently too. I assume that was discussed at the conference. This particular piece, this is by Christine Gorman, one of the staff writers for Scientific American, was about a paper that appeared recently in Science Translational Medicine that looked at. This is by people at Johns Hopkins and a private company, and I guess what they're doing is there's this form of testing now where I guess you do a biopsy and then you're looking for mutations that are characteristic of certain kinds of cancer, and then that tells you whether or not you need treatment and so forth, and what kind of treatment. And what these guys, and apparently it's quite common now to just do the testing, and you've got a whole array of mutations that are supposed to be associated with certain kinds of cancer.
Yeah.
And you do not compare them to the genetic makeup of non-cancerous tissue. But these guys, for this study, did do that, compared cancerous tissue to non-cancerous tissue. And what they found was that that many of the mutations associated with cancer, supposedly associated with cancer, also turned up in the perfectly healthy tissue.
Yeah, right.
And that they said, I'm just looking at the Scientific American piece now, about a third of the mutations, so-called actionable genes. You find this genetic variant, and you say, yeah, okay, this is cancer, and we have to do something about it. Turned out to be false positives. And often you had more than one of these mutations in a given set of tissue. So it meant that about half of the individual patients who were tested got a false positive diagnosis
Right.
of cancer, which is really disconcerting. And it reminds me of, I think we talked about this years ago. There was a study of people of their spinal columns that found that, so the assumption had always been if you have a bulging disc or other kinds of anomalies in your spinal column, this is associated with back pain and other sorts of problems, and then you get a spinal fusion operation or whatever. And but then at some point, it seems extraordinary that this wasn't done in the first place. A study was done of perfectly healthy people, and it discovered that bulging discs and all these other supposedly anomalous things that lead to problems are quite common in perfectly healthy people. And so that many of the people who are being treated because of these bulging discs may not have needed this form of treatment. And it seems as though there's something analogous going on with the tests for these genetic mutations supposedly associated with cancer.
Yeah. I mean, it's long been thought that for a cell to become a cancer cell and then grow into a tumor and then start metastasizing, spreading through the body, that it takes, somewhere on the order of, half a dozen different mutations.
Right.
Like one mutation will release the normal brakes that a cell has that keep it from dividing too rapidly. And another mutation will allow the cell to ignore signals that might be getting from the other cells that kind of sense that it's growing too fast and saying, slow down. Because, there's this whole complex network of communication going on among the cells. And then another mutation will turn off something called apoptosis, or programmed cell death, which leads cells to, essentially kill themselves, cellular suicide, if they just get too out of whack. And another one will allow the cell to start secreting the growth factors it needs to sprout its own blood vessel system and connect to the human body's circulatory system, both for nourishment and to give it, a way to spread. So you have to have, one of these mutations is usually not enough.
Right.
There's some cancers that take many fewer mutations, and particularly some blood cancers, and some that take more mutations. But, if you just get some of these, you're not necessarily going to develop into a cancer. And a lot of it depends on the context too. Like one cell, it's bad if it's mutated, but only in the context of another mutation. So it's it's not a linear process.
Right. Well, so this result isn't surprising to you, but apparently, according to this article,
no one had actually, and you're right. It's remarkable that somebody hadn't done that. If indeed they hadn't, and that's certainly the impression I got from that story.
Yeah, and it says it gives me the impression that the standard testing method does not involve a comparison of cancerous and healthy tissue to check for possible false positives.
No, yeah, I think the standard thing is you biopsy the tumor, and then you send it to the pathology lab, and they have certain standard tests they do, and of course now genetic testing and sequencing has become so much easier and less expensive, and not routine, but closer to closer to being, something that's, almost routine.
Yeah.
And, therefore they can do this. But, and yeah, it just shows that, there's ways that you can really refine the approach that, that's being taken to avoid over-treatment and unnecessary treatment.
Was there at the cancer meeting? Was there any discussion of these issues that you and I have discussed, and that lots of folks are now starting to pay attention to over testing and over diagnosis of cancer?
Oh, I didn't notice any sessions, but this is like 18,000 people,
Right.
all converging and during any one moment, there's a dozen or more different sessions going on all over this vast convention center. But that certainly wasn't a big focus. There may have been sessions here and there on that, but that tends not to be discussed as much as it probably should be.
Yeah. Well, because that brings me to another article that I wanted to just briefly mention. This was there was I think it was a blog post by a healthcare analyst in the New York Times. Then I went to the study that he was writing about. This is something in Health Affairs, and it is a study. New analysis reexamines the value of cancer care in the United States compared to Western Europe. So apparently there was a study that was published a couple of years ago that supposedly demonstrated that, we spend a lot more on cancer care in the United States than they do over there in Europe, but it's worth it. We're saving a lot of lives, and apparently this earlier study demonstrated an economic benefit somehow to our much more expensive care. And this paper demolishes that, and it's got some really disturbing statistics. So it says, although the information wasn't presented in a very user-friendly way, so I'm going to try to parse it a little bit. They looked at rates of cancer mortality. The earlier study apparently had looked at cancer survival rates. So how long do people live after they're first diagnosed with cancer? And the obvious problem with that is that if you're testing people much more often with more sophisticated instruments, then you're gonna detect their cancer much earlier. But that doesn't necessarily mean they will live any longer. That's one of the problems.
It's fascinating.
Right.
Fascinating paradox. I think I first came across that in an old article. It must have been 20 years ago or so in the Atlantic Monthly.
And now it
just blew me away. Like, it's one of these things. It's like, oh, of course.
Right.
You detect it sooner. It appears that they survived longer, but they died at the same time. They would have anyway. They just knew about it.
Right. And so you could say that's not a positive. That's a negative, because people have lived longer knowing that they have cancer. But so this study looks at mortality strictly, just how long do people live, and it found that compared to Western Europe, for 3 of the 4 costliest cancers, these are breast, colorectal, and prostate, there were that people are dying at a slower rate in the United States. So there were 67,000, 265,000, 60,000 averted U.S. deaths for those 3 cancers: breast, colon, and prostate. But at great extra cost. 402,000 per year saved, or per extra year that people lived for breast cancer, 110,000 colon cancer, almost 2 million for prostate cancer. But here is the shocker: more people died during this period of lung cancer. Many more people died, about 1,100,000 of lung cancer, even though we spend a lot more money on lung cancer treatment. in the United States than in Europe. So if you add all
Yeah.
these numbers together, this isn't in the article. This is just for me to try to
Hmm.
understand the implications of this.
Hmm.
From the four major cancer killer, in spite of our spending much more money, and then there wasn't a separate breakdown for spending, which at least I couldn't find it in the study. 700,000 excess U.S. deaths from cancer in the United States over Europe, in spite of us spending much, much more
Yeah, yeah,
on cancer care, which is
yeah.
that I feel as though that should be every cancer researcher and every oncologist should be talking about that and trying to
Mm.
understand why how that could possibly happen, because that is a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's very hard to make these comparisons between two countries, even ones with similar standards of living, like the United States and Western Europe. But yeah, I think there's a pretty developing and becoming widespread agreement that we're just not getting anywhere near the bang for the buck when it comes to health spending in the United States on all kinds of fronts, including cancer. And with cancer, it's an especially salient point because some of these new therapies are just so astronomically expensive, and they usually are only promising extra months or extra years of life. And it's easy. I mean, being one of those patients and thinking about having the possibility of a small amount of added life, it's hard to argue with somebody wanting to go with that, if they possibly can, and having an insurance system that mostly reimburses for that. But
Well, but
a lot of times these drugs only offer, like, one new one will be more expensive than the existing one, which is already comes at an astronomical cost, and yet the second one will offer just a barely measurable statistical advantage in clinical trials.
well, but what this study suggests, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but this part seems pretty clear to me,
Hmm.
is that when it comes to lung cancer, and
Hmm.
also this is also true of melanoma and cervical cancer, we
Yeah,
also are spending much more than they are spending in Europe, but actually our mortality is higher.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so that in those three cases, it's not a matter of coming up with very expensive treatments that are giving
Okay,
people
yeah,
marginally longer lives. It's that
yeah,
we're doing something, and people aren't living as long
yeah, yeah,
in spite of spending more here.
yeah, yeah.
So, which is a, you know, that's not a matter of sort of let's debate the ethics and economics of this. That's we're doing something really wrong that's
Yeah.
actually hurting people.
Well, but part of what might be called doing something wrong is engaging in what I haven't seen any comparisons, but I suspect the number of clinical trials for very cutting edge therapies. There's quite a larger proportion of those happening in the United States than even in any particular Western European country.
Right.
So a lot of those are going to be enormously, clinical trials just cost just a staggering amount of money, and then most of them lead to drugs that end up not getting FDA approval.
Right.
And that's all money that would be considered through one perspective of being wasted
Mm-hmm.
in not leading to increase mortality. But on the other hand, the question is, what better system can we come up with to find out earlier on whether a drug really deserves to go through a clinical trial and get them to market faster. And there's a lot of discussion of that at AACR meetings and throughout the field of what can you do in the preclinical stage, like when you're still investigating these things in the laboratory and in petri dishes and the equivalent, and these microchip arrays and how can you do pre-screening for the people that you might try out in a clinical trial to see which ones, so you have a rational basis to say, these patients are more likely to respond, and therefore we should design the trial, taking that into account. I mean, they do this, but I think everyone agrees they could do this a lot better.
Well, so are you saying that we're doing these clinical trials, and we're engaged in more high risk, potentially high payoff research, and so some people are taking drugs that turn out to be toxic, and that explains the higher mortality rate?
No,
Oh, you're not
not toxic, but that don't work.
right.
And these are usually people that, with our current understanding of the cancer and the treatments we have, they would have died in any case. And then you have a drug, that you have reason to believe might extend their lives, by months, or, what they call mean-free survival time, or even years. And so you're kind of comparing people getting the standard treatment is the default case with people trying to get the new treatment. But sometimes that's all very confused because the standard treatment is something that was already used on the patients, some of the patients. And, trials have different criteria. Some of them, they want naive cancer cells that have not been exposed to previous treatments. And some it's, if every other treatment has been exhausted, this is so risky that we're only going to do it then. So it's just so many complicated factors that I haven't gotten my mind around it. But
I would assume that they're talking about massive numbers, and that the clinical trials would be only a small part of the statistics that are being analyzed.
Yeah.
But
it's probably a large proportion of the money that's spent, though.
Yeah. Oh, that could be if they're talking about if the clinical trial costs are folded into.
Maybe they're not. I don't really know. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here because I don't think there's any question that we're over-treating people, that healthcare costs have just gotten completely out of control, and on one front after another, including cancer, there's not really a sign that this is paying off.
Yeah, I just every time we talk about this, I think of this as being. It's just such an important topic. And,
it is.
This study comparing Europe to the United States, there's one, I read about it on one blog in the New York Times. That seems to be the major news. And I wanted to know so much more about this. As I said, the study itself is presented in a kind of obscure, counterintuitive way. So maybe the hordes of blogging heads viewers can demand more attention be paid to this issue.
I mean, it's interesting. When I saw that particular op-ed piece on the study, I mean, my thought was sort of like, well, yeah, this is really bad, but I've read this in many different contexts before, so it didn't surprise me. And maybe that's the problem. I've just become so inured to reading about the problem of just throwing an ever mounting amount of money at various medical problems and not really having the payoff, and just trying to get to the root of it. How much of it is our medical insurance system and the pharmaceutical industry and the ties between the two, and of course what probably the main answer is not having universal single payer medical care.
Well, that's a good segue to another article I thought we might discuss. It's taken a really big overview. I don't know if you saw it. This is in the a recent, May 11th issue of the New Yorker.
Mm-hmm.
You and I, 6 years ago, talked about an article by the physician Atul Gawande.
Oh, he's great.
Who is fantastic. I don't know how this guy has a full-time medical practice and is such an amazing medical journalist as well.
Yeah,
I mean, he's really like a freak of nature, and I'm so impressed. Plus, he's a hell of a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that article back in 2009 had a huge impact on the debate over healthcare, and as I recall, Obama cited it when he was making the case for the Affordable Health Care Act, saying that our system is broken and we have to do something about it. Gawande focused on these two counties in Texas, and one had extremely high per capita health care costs, and the other quite modest. The high county was, or town, I guess it was, McAllen, Texas, had some of the highest per capita costs for Medicare in the country. And Gawande looked closely at what was going on there, and it just seemed like uh, capitalism run amok in healthcare. That you had hospitals and physicians who were over testing people and over treating them, and the obvious reason was, or at least this is what the article suggested, was that the hospitals and doctors make more money that way, and
Yeah, well,
that it obviously wasn't, and it wasn't leading to better healthcare outcomes. In fact, it was leading to poorer outcomes
yeah,
for lots
yeah,
of patients.
yeah.
And it was a real blockbuster, and he thought that this indicated that there was something fundamentally wrong with medicine, especially when it's driven by free market forces. And he had some suggestions for possible ways to address this problem at the end, but it was really a pretty negative. It was a real downer of an article.
Mm,
And he's got a new article going back to that and talking about the same problem. It still exists in this country, and Gawande updates us on over testing of patients. He's got lots of examples of that, over treatment of patients. But he said that there are a lot of positive trends away from this and toward a type of healthcare that is its effectiveness is gauged according to how well the patients do, which seems like
yeah,
it should be an obvious thing. But there are ways of rewarding physicians and
yeah.
hospitals and so forth for actually cutting the costs of healthcare by reducing unnecessary treatment and tests that have been applied successfully in many places, including the villain of his previous piece, McAllen, Texas.
Oh, he brings them back.
He
Oh,
brings them back,
interesting.
and what's really interesting is that he goes back and re-interviews a lot of the people that he talked about in the first article, and many of them say they hated him, that there was an uproar in the medical community and McAllen. They felt really unfairly singled out, that they're portrayed
Yeah,
as greedy bastards who didn't care about their patients, just cared about making money. But then it led to a lot of soul searching and changes in the way that medicine is practiced there that have really driven down health costs and
interesting.
led to
Wow,
better outcomes for patients.
wow. So this was more hopeful, it sounds like, than the last
It was
piece.
much more hopeful, and it was the dream of every journalist that you write something, you identify a problem, and people get
Mm,
really angry and try to refute you. I remember there was a lot of blowback against
yeah,
this article. Some people even saying that it had some fundamental errors, but some of the people that were especially targeted in that article have changed their ways.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Gawande also talks about these large healthcare providers. One is Walmart, that have identified medical centers that have very high outcomes for patients
Mm,
at very low cost.
hmm,
And they are for really important, expensive procedures like heart surgery and so forth. They're steering their patients to some of these centers that have just proven to be really good at keeping costs down,
yeah.
and it's driving down the costs for some of these big
Wow.
providers. And what Gawande says is that the most significant aspect of this is just not giving people treatment that they don't need.
Yeah, yeah,
And he
yeah.
actually identifies one of the things that he talks about. Apparently, I forget if he says it's um, uh, the most widely prescribed significant operation, or among the most,
Mm-hmm.
He focuses on these are spinal fusion
Oh, yeah. Well, that's
operations.
notorious.
Yeah, so people who are really experiencing severe back pain and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
they're done at an enormous rate, and it turns out that often people get worse, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't need the treatment, and there are just exercises, there are things that they can do, drugs that they can take to alleviate the pain, uh, to reduce the inflammation, that are really cheap, and people get better. They have better outcomes than if they get
Yeah,
the
yeah,
surgery.
yeah, yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
it's true in so many, just so many areas of medicine, and but it's not. You can't just blame it on doctors' greed and making more money. It's just this interlocking system that I think unfortunately arises naturally out of having a market-based medicine. And and one thing is with the patient, if you go in and you have some complaint and the doctor gives you some kind of standard tests or just palpate, um, get out the stethoscope and you just got the old fashioned Marcus Welby MD kind of treatment, and you spent all this time on the internet reading about all these new tests, and you're going to say, well,
right.
wait, what about this? I mean, he says, well, the pain in your neck, I think it's because you need to get a different kind of pillow or something. And she says, oh, no, I've already tried that. I don't think it's working. And I read that there's a certain condition and I think I really need an MRI or a CT scan. And then you have the doctor, part of his or her consideration as well. Well, what if I'm wrong, even though I don't think I am? I'm giving my best judgment, but I could still, if I am wrong, be sued for undertreatment,
Absolutely.
for malpractice.
Yep.
And my malpractice rates have also gone through the roof because everyone's has, and also because I was the victim of just a couple of complete nuisance suits by people who had the legal power to force a settlement. So, they're covering themselves as people naturally do. And then
Yep.
in addition, you have the whole pharmaceutical industry where when they spend as much money as they do developing a drug and getting it through clinical trials, and it's one of the handful that actually is approved by the FDA and the other expenses already written off, there's going to be a lot of burden then for that drug to be able to make enough costs to pay back the shareholders and the corporate CEO, so he can justify the fact that he's getting 10 or 15 million dollars a year before his bonus and benefits. And it's a bad system. And of course the question is, if this were, say, if all cancer research was done by the National Institutes of Health, by, let's say, a big government agency, all drug development was nationalized, and at great expense and probably astronomically higher taxes, is this going to result in developing, the occasional true breakthroughs that have come from the big pharmaceutical industry?
Right.
Like Gleevec, which is basically taken a type of leukemia and turned it from being an inevitably fatal condition to being something that's usually manageable as a chronic illness, or even just as something you chronically treat. And
You know, all those concerns of yours are addressed in this
I'm
wonderful
sure they
article.
are.
I mean,
Yeah.
he's got a terrific story in the middle about a guy who
Mm-hmm.
had severe back pain and he was diagnosed with a degenerative disc
Mm-hmm.
disease, and he's going to his doctor and he's pretty much demanding surgery. He and his
Mm-hmm.
wife, his pain is killing him,
Yeah.
and his doctor says, uh, just presents him with the statistics saying that the surgery just doesn't work that well, and let's try some of
Mm-hmm.
these other things. The patient was
Yeah.
really reluctant, and
Mm-hmm.
it took months, but then he made almost a complete recovery, and he felt
Yeah.
great. And he talked
That's
about
great.
how listen, if I'd had my druthers, I would have gotten that surgery, and I might have been worse off
Yeah.
than before I got
Yeah.
the surgery. So it
Yeah.
requires, and of course, the threat of lawsuits, malpractice, that needs to be reformed as well. That was
Yeah.
called for by the Affordable Health
Right.
Care Act. I
Right.
think we also need. I remember every time I've written about tests for prostate cancer and breast cancer, and presented the statistics on how many people get false diagnoses and
Yeah.
unnecessary treatment. I still get all this blowback from people saying, I don't care if I'm one in a million, then I want to know if I have that cancer. They,
Yeah.
defending
Yeah.
defending tests when they are perfectly healthy, which now are looking to be really a major part of the inflated healthcare costs in this country.
Oh, well, yeah. And, yeah, from the individual patient's perspective, and especially if a patient, through early detection, found out about a cancer and then the cancer was treated, at stage one, and then, 10 years later they're healthy, they're going to say, boy, I'm glad I got that test. But of
Exactly.
course, what we've been learning is so many of the cancers that are caught early on are, harmless little precancers that never would have developed into a full-blown cancer. But then they're getting better at telling one from the other, but, still have a long way to go.
Yeah,
But
it requires I think a kind of massive education shift in public perception and the way that Americans look
yeah,
at healthcare and the value of tests
yeah,
and treatment. It's I think it's part of our can-do spirit.
yeah,
Not to get not to drag in one of my hobby horses here, but I see it as akin to the way we conduct foreign policy. We just
mm,
hate to stand by and do nothing.
yeah,
And
right.
so, let's just bomb them for a little bit and see what
Yeah, let's
happens.
adopt a wait and see attitude toward ISIS.
Right. We don't want to do that,
Yeah,
and we don't like treating cancer that way, even when presented with massive evidence that patience
yeah,
sometimes is the best
yeah.
policy.
Well, I think more doctors too are, it's much harder, I think, to get patients to think that way when you have a personal stake. And I
Yeah.
think I think more doctors are definitely becoming aware of that. I mean, the way that my internist, um, presented me with the idea of prostate cancer test,
Hmm.
screening, was, well, as I'm sure you know, because, we talk about this stuff, there's a lot of controversy about this, to say the least, and I just kind of leave it to the patient. And she wasn't pushing it at all. And and I just decided, nah, I mean, everything I've read about this, you know, persuades me personally that there's not a real reason for these tests. And if it does detect something, the risk of a false positive is much too high, and it's a false positive that could lead to debilitating consequences. And
Yeah.
but then if you do, for whatever reason, end up, maybe it's because you had the test, and you end up getting the biopsy, and they do find that you have, what appears to be a very low grade smoldering cancer or precancer, then it becomes a lot more difficult to decide not to treat it, even though, again, most of those, are probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I've been recently corresponding with someone who read my book at about the time he had a prostate biopsy, and this thing called the Gleason test, and his Gleason score was slightly above the level where it was standard to recommend treatment. And he was just doing all the research, and I helped get him in touch with some people I knew from doing my own research for the book. And the last I heard from him, after all this agonizing, and he sends me these really long, erudite emails about his consideration in this study versus that study. He decided not to get the treatment.
Good.
But it's a very difficult decision. And of course, there's part of him that's going, good God, am I making the right decision? And that's what these things, when they come down to the personal level and the overpowering strength of our survival instinct.
Hey, maybe next time we talk, we can talk about rehabilitation for alcoholism and drug addiction.
Oh, what
Because
has that been?
I'm not gonna. It's something that I've been thinking a lot
Oh,
about,
good.
and
Yeah.
it raises some of the same issues
Oh,
that
yeah. Let's get into that next time. There was a piece in the Atlantic, right,
yeah,
about
and I,
Alcoholics Anonymous that got a lot of
yeah, and I
people
shredded
angry.
that yeah, that was I thought that was a terrible article. So I actually wrote about it on my blog and tried to
Oh, I
show
missed that.
how
Oh,
hollow it was. But it's a really important topic,
yeah, yeah.
how to
Oh, yeah.
treat
Well,
drug
yeah.
addiction.
Let's take that up. And I meant to somehow an hour went by, but
No, that's
yeah,
it.
I had wanted to talk about your two most recent columns in Scientific American on Stephen Weinberg and Oliver Sacks, but I guess we can save that.
Yeah, some other time. This is this was really important stuff that we're covering today. So
Yeah, I think so.
I'm
Yeah,
glad
I
we.
mean, there's no question that it's important,
Yeah,
but yeah, I just feel kind of powerless before the problem.
you're doing your part, trying to
Uh,
educating the masses.
I
Don't
don't know.
worry.
I mostly just, I write about the science, and that's a lot easier than the social issues and the policy.
Yeah. Well, it's all important. So
Yeah, yeah.
I appreciate. I always really am informed and enlightened reading your stuff. So thank you once
Oh,
again,
thanks.
George.
And vice versa.
Okay. All right. I will. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, hang in there.
Okay. You too.